The sun was beating down on the small but bustling city of Montgomery, Alabama. Inside the marble-clad halls of Haven Trust Bank, a mixture of hushed conversations and the rhythmic tapping of keyboards filled the air. The morning rush was winding down, and most of the employees were settling into their usual routines. Amid the backdrop of polished professionalism, a man stepped through the tall glass doors. He was tall, with sharp features and an air of quiet confidence. His crisp navy suit, tailored to perfection, hinted at someone who valued presentation but didn't flaunt it. His name was Marcus Allen, a name known to very few in the building, though it soon would be etched into their memories forever. Marcus walked to the nearest customer service desk, greeted the clerk with a polite smile, and asked to make a simple transaction. Before the clerk could assist him, a firm voice interjected from across the room. "Excuse me, I'll handle this," barked the bank manager, a man named Greg Benson. Greg's tone wasn't friendly. It carried an edge, as though Marcus's mere presence disrupted the bank's flow. Greg was known among his staff for his rigid demeanor. His self-imposed title as the bank's gatekeeper meant he relished moments where he could exercise authority, especially when his biases went unchecked. Greg approached Marcus with a tight-lipped smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Sir," Greg began, glancing Marcus up and down in a way that betrayed his assumptions. "We have certain policies here. I'll need to see proper identification before proceeding." Marcus's expression didn't waver. Calmly, he slid his ID across the counter and waited. Greg picked it up, inspecting it longer than necessary, his face growing visibly skeptical. "What is the purpose of your visit today?" Greg asked, his tone sharper now, as though Marcus's presence demanded extra scrutiny. "I'd like to withdraw from my account," Marcus said, his voice steady but firm. Greg glanced at the ID again, then at Marcus. "I'm sorry, but we can't process this without further verification. You understand. It's just policy." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Policy or something else?" The room grew quieter. A few employees and customers nearby began to take notice, their stolen glances filled with curiosity and unease. Marcus stood his ground, saying nothing further, waiting for Greg to clarify. Greg cleared his throat, his voice rising as though he wanted to make a point. "If you don't have additional verification, I suggest you return when you do." "I see," Marcus said, his voice calm yet heavy with meaning. "You're refusing to serve me, then." "I didn't say that," Greg shot back quickly, his face flushing. "But we take fraud very seriously here. Sir, I'm sure you understand." Marcus held Greg's gaze for a moment longer, then gave a faint nod. "I do understand. More than you realize." The tension in the room was palpable, but Marcus didn't raise his voice nor appear flustered. Instead, he reached into his pocket and produced a sleek black phone. With a few taps, he placed a call, his voice low but direct. "Yes, this is Marcus. Could you send someone down to Haven Trust Bank? It seems there's been a misunderstanding." As he hung up, Marcus turned back to Greg, who now looked more confused than confident. "Let's wait a moment," Marcus said with a faint, enigmatic smile. The minutes that followed felt longer than they were. Eyes darted nervously across the room, while Greg fidgeted behind the counter, unsure of what to say next. Marcus stood calmly, hands clasped in front of him, as though the entire scene were unfolding just as he had expected. The silence in the bank was almost deafening, broken only by the occasional shuffle of papers or a forced cough. Customers shifted uneasily, some pretending not to notice the tension while others openly stared. Greg, trying to reclaim a sense of control, folded his arms and leaned over the counter. "You can't expect special treatment, sir," Greg said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Rules are rules." Marcus met his gaze steadily. "I'm not asking for special treatment, just the same treatment as anyone else." This quiet assertion seemed to irritate Greg further. "You people always think," he caught himself mid-sentence, his face reddening. "You people?" Marcus repeated, his voice steady but cutting. Greg stammered, suddenly aware that others were listening. "I meant customers who don't follow proper procedures." By now, even the clerks behind their desks had stopped working, their attention fixed on the unfolding scene. One of them, a young woman named Erin, whispered to her colleague, "Do you think he'll call the police?" The colleague shrugged nervously, whispering back, "Greg loves throwing his weight around, but this guy doesn't seem fazed." Meanwhile, Greg had taken out a clipboard, pretending to check some documents. It was a futile attempt to look busy, as though the confrontation wasn't worth his full attention. "If you can't provide additional proof of your account, I'll have to ask you to leave," he said firmly. Marcus smiled faintly, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You're quite confident in your judgment, Mr. Benson." Greg bristled. "That's my job. Ensuring this bank operates with integrity." "Integrity," Marcus repeated, the word heavy with irony. He turned slightly, addressing the room. "Is this how Haven Trust Bank defines integrity? By denying service based on assumptions?" Greg's face hardened. "Sir, I'll have to ask you to leave if you continue disrupting business." At that moment, the glass doors of the bank swung open with a quiet hiss, and a tall man in a gray suit walked in. His stride was purposeful, his presence commanding. Heads turned as he approached the counter where Marcus stood. "Mr. Allen," the newcomer greeted Marcus, his voice filled with deference. "I came as quickly as I could." The room froze. Greg blinked, looking between Marcus and the newcomer. "Mr. Allen?" Greg echoed, his tone uncertain. "Yes, Mr. Benson," the man in the gray suit said, turning to face Greg. "Marcus Allen, the principal owner of Haven Trust Bank." The words hit like a thunderclap. Greg's face drained of color as his clipboard slipped from his hands and clattered onto the counter. You own the bank?" Greg stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus turned to him, his expression calm but unyielding. "That's correct. And yet here I am, being refused service by the very people I've entrusted to uphold the values of this institution." A murmur rippled through the room. Employees exchanged wide-eyed glances, while customers whispered among themselves. Erin covered her mouth, trying to suppress a gasp. Greg opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He looked like a man grasping at straws, trying to piece together an explanation. Marcus didn't wait for him to recover. "You see, Mr. Benson, I came here today to observe, to understand the experience of our customers firsthand. What I didn't expect was a demonstration of bias and disrespect from someone in your position." The man in the gray suit cleared his throat. "Mr. Allen, would you like to discuss this in the boardroom, or shall we address it here?" Marcus glanced around the room, his gaze lingering on the faces of the employees and customers who had borne witness to the scene. "No," he said firmly. "We'll address it here. Everyone should hear this." Greg swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he gripped the edge of the counter. The atmosphere in the bank shifted as the realization of Marcus's identity began to sink in. Greg's confidence had crumbled, replaced by visible anxiety. He opened and closed his mouth like a man searching for an escape route, but there was none. Marcus's voice broke the heavy silence. "Mr. Benson, as the manager of this branch, you represent the face of this bank to every person who walks through these doors. Your actions today tell me something troubling about what this institution might truly stand for, or at least what you stand for." Greg tried to recover. I assure you, sir, this was a misunderstanding. We have strict policies to prevent fraud, and I was only—" "Stop," Marcus interrupted, his voice calm but silencing the room instantly. He took a step closer, placing his hands lightly on the counter. "This wasn't about fraud prevention. This was about your assumptions. You saw me walk in, decided I didn't belong, and acted accordingly. Let's not sugarcoat it." Greg's cheeks flushed, and he looked down at the counter. Marcus continued, his tone measured but piercing. "You didn't bother to ask questions. You didn't look up my account details. Instead, you made a judgment based on nothing but what you thought you knew. And you were wrong." The staff stood frozen, their eyes darting nervously between Marcus and Greg. The customers whispered among themselves, some nodding in agreement with Marcus's words. The man in the gray suit interjected cautiously. "Perhaps,